I feel like my artistic project is writing comedies about things that aren't funny, right? To me, that feeling of like laughing and being sort of terrified and being destroyed at the same time is what it feels like to be alive right now, you know? And so I kind of chase that, right? And I think, how can a moment be both horrifying and hilarious? I think you have to laugh to cry and you have to cry to laugh.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences. And today, I'm joined by two guests who are going to talk with me about a moving new off-Broadway play currently on stage at the Atlantic Theater Company here in New York City. The Reservoir, a co-production with the Ensemble Studio Theatre and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, touches on many universal themes, including aging, family, recovery, and memory. So joining me today in the studio are playwright Jake Brasch and Stuart Firestein. Stuart is a neurobiologist at Columbia University who also advises the Ensemble Studio Theatre and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Science and Technology Project. This initiative has been designed to stimulate artists to create work that explores the worlds of science and technology and to challenge the existing stereotypes of scientists and engineers in the popular imagination. Jake Brasch is the playwright, and we're delighted, Jake, to have you with us as well today. Thank you both for joining us on Shaping Science. So Jake, tell us a little bit about you. Obviously, this is not your first play, but this seems to be a deeply personal play, as also a play that raises a lot of themes that we're interested in at the New York Academy of Sciences, not just because it brings the arts and sciences together, but it tells such an incredibly poignant story, both about a young man obviously dealing with personal challenges, but about him, his mother, and his four wonderful grandparents, all of whom, in some way or another, are confronting some of the kinds of major issues that have to do not only with life, but also with the functioning and sometimes malfunctioning of this organ in our heads, the brain, about which our colleague here, the neurobiologist, neuroscientist Stuart Firestein, is going to be able to speak more authoritatively than us.
Yes. Yes. Who knows nothing.
Certainly more than me.
So Jake, tell us a little bit about you and how did you get involved in playwriting? And I believe you also do other things like being a clown. And
I am a clown. I actually like to say that I identify first and foremost as a clown.
Okay, well,
and I worked as an actual birthday party clown for 10 years, but also spiritually, I identify as a clown. But no, I am from Denver, Colorado. Mm-hmm. I like to say I was born a 40-year-old gay man, obsessed with theater from birth. My parents were like, well, where did this guy come from? Screaming about Angela Lansbury on the playground. And I was a fan before I was a creator. And then I was an actor before I was a writer. Mm-hmm. I went to an arts middle school and high school magnet, which was a super life-changing experience. Then I went to NYU for undergrad as an actor, mm-hmm. and then sort of gradually after that drifted into playwriting, and actually getting into Youngblood, which is a cohort of young writers at the Ensemble Studio Theatre, was kind of my first big yes, was my first sort of, oh wait, maybe I actually can write professionally, and that's where I kind of developed my voice. And then this play, while it's not my first play, is the play that's kind of opened every door for me. Mm-hmm. And it's specifically about the year, or loosely based on the year, that I moved home to get sober, and as you said, reconnected with my four aging grandparents and made a connection between the fogginess of early recovery and their fogginess and various states of mental decline. Right. And I started actually with the science because it began as a one-page pitch to the Sloan Foundation for the commission, and came across this notion of cognitive reserve, which is, I'm sure Stuart can speak to better than I can, but is this notion, this question of what, if anything, can one do to protect themselves from the onset of dementia or other decline or injury or whatever it may be. So it's why people do puzzles and eat specifically. So I started there and then accidentally kind of stumbled into realizing that I was writing something deeply personal and also about recovery, and even more specifically than the science of addiction and recovery, what it meant for various members of one family who all are neurotic to some degree, how to sort of cope with their own brains.
Well, let's start with the brain of the eponymous character, and not named Jake, named Josh, but nevertheless clearly modeled in part on your own experience. But he's off in school at NYU, and indeed is having serious issues with alcohol, and doesn't even quite know how he gets home.
Right.
And of course, the wonderful actor who plays the role is on stage every second of the entire production, including at least 20 minutes before it begins, splayed out on the floor in a way that one doesn't kind of understand until the play actually begins. But nevertheless, quite a feat to do. But tell me a little bit more about why you wanted to focus on the question of addiction, of alcoholism, and also the kind of relationship between personal decision-making, responsibility, will on the one side, and obviously the very serious pressures that come from addiction and all the kinds of things that go along with it on the other. In other plays, have you had characters like this? Is this the first time you kind of brought your own experience in this kind of way onto the stage, or have you been kind of moving in this direction for a while?
I think all writers, the secret is that every play any writer writes is usually or refracted at least through their own experiences, right? And this one is just explicitly so, or almost explicitly so, right? It is my first play in which I have sort of written myself into it, or a me-like character. But it doesn't feel like it's more me than my other plays, if that makes sense. And I do think this question of how does one live inside their own brain is something that tracks through my work. And sort of how to take opposite action than sometimes your impulses tell you to. And what does it mean to sort of be after betterment? And how do you try to fix a brain with a brain, I think is something that I think about a lot. And in this play specifically, I think it's about noise and sort of how this character thinks that if he can fix things, if he can sort of feel better inside of himself, that's when he'll be better. And really what his lesson is, of course, is just learning how to live with himself and learning how to live with that noise and sort of understanding the places that his brain will take him that he doesn't want to go, and that gradual, painful self-knowledge and the hilarity along the way.
Well, one thing I will say, and I'll let you speak more about this, and Stuart as well, is that even though the themes of the play are weighty to say the least, you imbue so much humor, not just in all the characters, but in the overall play, that you have the audience laughing all the way through. And you must have some kind of sense of how you combine the comedic and the tragic, because you use it incredibly well and powerfully.
Well, thank you.
But in a way that, is always sort of on the edge.
I mean, I'm so fascinated by, that edge is I feel like my artistic project is writing comedies about things that aren't funny, right? To me, that feeling of laughing and being sort of terrified and being destroyed at the same time is what it feels like to be alive right now, And so I kind of chase that, right? And I think, how can a moment be both horrifying and hilarious? I think you have to laugh to cry and you have to cry to laugh. And I think the play actually allows itself to go to much darker places because of the fact that humor is such an ingredient. The audiences are willing to go with it, whereas I think they might be repelled by something that is this is just dark, 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 dark. And I think the play purposefully off-foots you. You kind of don't know tonally sometimes how you're supposed to feel. Are you allowed to laugh? are you allowed to cry?
Right.
And to me, that's what it feels like to be sort of in the center of crisis. And so I think I have realized as I've been working on the play that I'm kind of trying to create the somatic experience of the main character in the audience member watching it.
I mean, I can certainly tell you it's not like watching A Long Day's Journey into Night, which
Right.
is one of many plays that has some of these themes, and clearly you're writing in a way with and against that kind of tradition of the dysfunctional family in which alcohol plays or addiction plays a major role. But again, before we talk about some of the kinds of neuroscience questions, I'd like you just to kind of set up for us the mise en scène of the play, because you'll do a better job than I will anyway. You wrote the play. But we don't want to give away too much of the plot.
Sure.
This is if we do a spoiler alert, we'll have to cut it out because the play is still running, and we want the listeners to our podcast to go off and
Please, yeah.
see it for themselves. But just kind of set the scene. I mean, there's clearly the main character, Josh, his mother, his 4 grandparents, and her friend, ultimately, who are on the stage, and
right.
that's the cast of characters. But could you say a little bit more about them and how you sort of have them all introduced
Sure.
in the play? So that's the early part of the plot, not what ensues.
Yes. Opens on our main character asleep, and he wakes up, assuming he's in Florida, quickly realizes that he's at the banks of the Cherry Creek Reservoir in Denver, which is where he's from. And he got kicked out of rehab for fermenting grapefruit juice in the boiler room. And now he's back home, and his mom is just at wit's end and horrified as to what is happening, and is scared that he's going to get back on the same sort of loop that he's been on, when he discovers or comes across the idea that maybe his grandparents can be sort of an instrumental part of helping him get back to himself. And as soon as we introduce the grandparents, they're mostly on stage for the entirety of the play, right? And I say in the stage directions, they're there to hold Josh until he can be there for himself, right? And so they kind of create a Greek chorus that is constantly chattering as we move in and out of reality, semi-reality, and pure surrealism, right? As we're sort of modeling what it feels like to be inside of an hyperactive, broken brain trying to figure out how to fix himself with himself. So the play kind of takes place inside of this character's mind palace, as I like to say. And ultimately, he comes across this notion of cognitive reserve and another book about what he can do scientifically scientifically, I say, for those listening, quotation marks, scientifically, pseudoscientifically, eating spinach, drinking apple cider vinegar. He goes into this sort of like, what can I do willfully to fix myself? And it becomes this kind of farce with his grandparents of taking them to senior aerobics at the JCC, feeding them spinach, taking them to the art museum, and helping his grandpa with his second bar mitzvah. So it's hilarious and wild and ultimately kind of scary to watch someone sort of out of control. And then I won't say much more than that, but that sets the theme. And then, he learns some hard lessons, and it ends well.
But he, in part, is looking to fix himself.
Correct.
But his grandparents become convenient, points of projection.
Correct.
And indeed become the canvas upon which he tries to paint his own self-cure, right? By taking them, as you just said, to aerobics or to other kinds of events or locales or whatever, where the idea will be that he can help them.
Right.
And by helping them, of course, make himself feel useful, give himself a sense of purpose, and keep going in his own effort to obviously get control. But in that set of interactions, and again, each one is incredibly rich theatrically, and each one of the 4 grandparents are characters. I mean, to say the obvious, but also in the fullness of that term, really indicate that each one of them incredible actors and And yeah, they're both, at center stage, and they're then the chorus behind. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is obviously an effective way of having them always there. But tell me a little bit about what you were thinking when you have the grandparents one by one deal with their own kinds of issues. And it's not too late in the play, so I'll just say, there's a grandmother who succumbs fairly early on to full-bore Alzheimer's. And of course, Josh is upset that he wasn't told, although it turns out he was, and has his own issues of memory that, of course, become the recursive kind of theme, as it were, of that whole effort to try to understand where he is and what his relationship with his grandparents are, and so on. But but what were you thinking about the the biological character of memory loss as you were doing the play? And memory, of course, is an issue that comes up in almost all great art, certainly in theater across multiple genres. And you don't need to have a broken brain to have issues of how memory plays itself out, how it is projected by one onto the screen of the past or the screen of one's social relationships in ways that are often very self-interested. But you're interested in mixing, as it were, the drama of life with the biology. Yeah. So how are you kind of working this out as you were developing the idea for the play and then ultimately the script?
Well, I think I started with just being haunted by what happened to my grandparents and sort of asking myself, wait, how is it that something that's so prevalent and will, I think, be the #1 crisis and then, for a lot of families coming, in the next few years as folks are living longer and already is a major crisis, like how is it that we don't understand more about this, Alzheimer's? Even in the time since I've written this play, there's been a lot of science that's come out that's been like, actually, we're not so sure it's this, it might be this, and, or that Alzheimer's is a very specific kind of dementia, and maybe folks that have a different kind of dementia are being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I'd be very curious to hear you talk about that, Stuart. I think that there's a lot of mystery around this disease. I think about the first time that I brought this play to Denver. It was at the New Play Summit, and one of the grandmas in the play who is struggling with memory loss and is completely absent was still alive for the first reading, and I went to go visit her that week, and she had not said a single word in 7 years. It was brutal. And for some reason that week, she was like, I came in, my family didn't. She was like, hey, how's it going? And was just not totally making sense, but was there. And she passed away 2 weeks later, which I've later learned is a common phenomenon that happens and folks are not sure why. And those sorts of moments that are unbelievable fodder for art and also just so deeply haunting. I think I started there. And, my experience of researching for this play with both of these diseases, frankly, was mostly learning about how little we know, right? And the things that have been proven are like with addiction, for example, I read a study that was talking about folks who are from families of addiction, even if they are not raised by those parents, like adopted children of parents, are much more likely to have alcoholism. And we don't really know why that is. And, these things that are clearly scientific that we haven't caught up to yet, I think is a great place for art and a great place for this particular play, which is so much more about the questions than about the answers, right? I think ultimately that this character is desperate for answers and all he really gets to do is refine questions, which also feels very Jewish to me, which is baked into the play. So I think that sort of reflects my own experience, a desperate want to understand concepts, some of which there is science for that I was happy to absorb, and a lot of which there isn't. I think that's kind of what the play is up to and what my interest was as I was getting in there.
So I'd like to bring Stuart into the conversation and ask you, Stuart, since you are also in your background. And if you don't know this, listeners to the podcast,
Uh-oh.
one of the first of our Shaping Science podcasts was with Stuart about his academic work, only to find out that he began his life in theater and was in theater for a long time before going on to do his work in science, and the rest is great biology. But Stuart, as you watch the play, and obviously with a lot of experience of watching plays, but what did you make of the way in which Jake portrayed both Josh and his four grandparents in relationship to addiction and dementia? How did you sort of see some of the kinds of questions that you deal with in your academic work come onto the stage in ways that obviously you responded to as a theater goer and a theater aficionado?
So first, let me say that my laboratory and me personally do not work on either addiction, or at least directly work on addiction or Alzheimer's or other mental, age-related mental issues. But of course we keep up with it and we're interested in it. My laboratory works in the sense of smell and taste, which actually is very closely related to addiction, it turns out. So obesity and things like that are actually addiction-oriented issues. It's not that people, whatever, we don't want to get into all of that. But in any case,
curious about that,
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but that's one of the reasons why this GLP-1, all these new drugs for quote, diabetes, but also obesity, also seem to have some effects on addiction. People who are alcoholics suddenly are not interested in alcohol anymore. And that's, I think, because the pathway and the eating issue, the obesity issue, is they just don't want to eat anymore. They're just not interested in food in the same way, because it seems that in ways we do not understand, these drugs alter reward centers and addiction centers and things like that. I will congratulate Jake on one thing that I picked up early on in the play. I said, well, I knew the play because I'd been involved with vetting the proposal and all the rest of that with the Sloan Foundation. But he has picked the two most difficult and burning questions in neuroscience today, for which he's exactly right. We have almost no answers. I mean, we have a ton of research and a lot going into it, but addiction and Alzheimer's or early mental deficiencies are two of the great mysteries of the brain and two of the most serious clinical issues we have individually for people, because it ruins their lives and ruins families, but also socially, societally, because it is already become very costly. And we don't have treatments. We just don't have treatments for these things. That's not to say that we don't know some things about them. We do, which is great, and eventually we will. I mean, this GLP-1 breakthrough is a remarkable thing. We'll see where it goes. But you know that all the pharma companies are working on potential addiction drugs because there's a lot to be done there. I teach neuroscience. I teach a first-year neuroscience course for our neuroscience majors, actually. And I always start the course off by saying the one thing that makes knowing about the brain most difficult is having one.
Right.
And I don't mean that it's too stupid to have one, to know. I think the brain is perfectly capable of understanding what it does. The problem is, as Jake finds out in this play, or has his characters find out, is that your first-person experience of having a brain will not tell you very much about how the damn thing works. And so you have this first-person experience of being an addict, of seeing people going through mental decline, and you sort of imagine what must be going on in their brain. You have this feeling, oh, well, I must be able to get into this and figure out what's going on, and you can't in the end, which is disappointing. But it means we have to find other ways of looking at the brain. We can't trust the first person. Your brain lies. There's a wonderful joke I have to tell, I guess, about this. From a comic named, I think his name is Emo Phillips. Excuse me. He's a comic in L.A. He's a little bit of a weird comic. Anyway, he has this line. I use this line in my class as well. He said, I always thought my brain was the most wonderful organ in my body. And then one day I thought to myself, wait a minute, who's telling me that? And then you realize all bets are off. It's bullshitting with you all the time, you know. It's presenting an image of itself, of you, of what it can do, what it wants to do, that has little to do with what's actually ticking away in there. Very frustrating, but I think this play catches that so well. The idea of putting addiction and mental decline together, age-related mental decline together, is quite interesting. I don't think that's done often. I mean, I don't know of any scientist, there may be one, but I don't know of any science that works on both of those things, sees them as somehow or another related or works on them.
So that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, whether in fact neuroscientists think of, there being similarities in terms of either brain dysfunction or areas of the brain that are closing down, or even neural processes that are similar. Obviously, there's there's issues of memory. Obviously, there's issues of the lack of self-knowledge, and the inability to control what the brain is to some extent doing. But you say that these are not seen as immediately parallel in a scientific.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable thing to say. I could be off on this, but I don't know of any laboratory or people publishing work that are working on these two things together. That's not to say that people don't see them as somehow being related in some areas. I mean, there's a well-known disease called Korsakoff syndrome, which is a result of alcoholism, and it's memory loss, short-term memory loss, which from the outside at least mimics dementia. It's this kind of, short-term memory. You remember things from years ago, but every 20 minutes you ask the same set of questions or say the same thing or something like that. And that's definitely alcohol-related. I mean, it's a known symptom of alcoholism.
Now, is that reversible over time if one stops drinking?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Usually by the time it shows up, there's sufficient damage to whatever's been damaged, and we don't always know that. I mean, to my knowledge, we still do not know exactly how alcohol works, why it kind of makes you lightheaded, why it reduces inhibition, why it becomes addictive. I mean, not everybody who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic, obviously. But for some people, it's very rapidly addictive, as much as any other drug is.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting is, in fact, the juxtaposition of these two different, but nevertheless, in some respects, similar set of, diseases or certainly conditions in the brain might actually yield some scientific benefit.
But it's quite possible. I mean, sure. Am I one to predict where the next great finding is going to become? Yes. I mean, there have been trials. I believe there's been some research on whether GLP-1 can reverse or slow down dementias or Alzheimer's, and they have not worked out, to my knowledge. So it doesn't seem to work there. So at least in that sense, not working on the same thing. So it seems so far.
So let me ask you, since this does come up in the play, it's actually part of the way in which, Jake, you plot it. But let me ask you a little bit about your sense, anyway, of what we read in the press all the time now, which is that some form of mental exercise, regular mental exercise, also physical exercise, but mental exercise is important for either preventing or at least deferring and possibly mitigating the onset of, if not Alzheimer's, certainly some of the more extreme symptoms associated with it. We hear that if you read, if you engage in social interaction, if you do puzzles, if you go back and take online courses in a serious kind of way, and so on and so forth, that it will have a measurable effect. At least that's how some of these studies get reported out in the more general media. What is, as a neuroscientist, what is your sense of this, and how do you evaluate, what's going into the relationship between, that kind of mental effort and that kind of mental result?
I would say, the bit of reading that I've done, and again, this is not exactly my area of expertise, but I would say it's now becoming more and more clear that physical activity is probably more important than mental activity in keeping the brain relatively youthful, if you will, or preserving what you can of it. This is an interesting shift in neuroscience in general that I think is very important. We have for years largely ignored what people call the motor end of the brain. That is the behavioral end, the part of the brain that moves your arms and legs around and gets you to do things. Because sensory systems, the input, we think, is so much nicer, it's so much more aesthetically pleasing. I mean, looking at, beautiful paintings, listening to concerts, whatever it might be, tasting great food, smelling beautiful scents, all those things. So they have a kind of an aesthetic quality about them. So they've gotten a great deal of attention. And the idea being somehow or other, they're good model systems for understanding how the brain perceives the world and what it does. And the motor system is just a sort of technical, run the machinery kind of thing, take some commands from upstairs and do this or that. But we're now beginning to realize that that's probably not the case, that the motor part of the brain may be its most important function, and that the sensory stuff is kind of kludged on top of it to keep us from bumping into walls and things like that, I mean, if you look at evolution, the initial kind of nerve nets and beginnings of brains, the earliest kind of brains, were involved in things like filter feeding or pumping peristalsis, which we still have in our intestines, of course, which are it's a whole nerve net down there involved in just pumping, breathing, swallowing, all these things, blinking, are remarkable actual, regularized movements that are taken care of by the brain quite unconsciously, but which we spend a large part of our brain power doing. And I guess I would say even something that we consider a very high cognitive ability, like talking, like what we're doing now, we would consider this to be highly cognitive, but really it's a huge demand on our motor systems. You know how many muscles we're using to talk now in our larynx, our tongue, our lips, our breathing apparatus, all the rest of that, knowing how much breath to take to get a sentence out, et cetera, et cetera. All of that's going on more or less unconsciously, but taking up a fair amount of brain power. So exercising that part of the brain, which we've kind of forgotten about in all this doing puzzles business, turns out to be rather important.
That's so interesting. I mentioned in the list of things that I at least read about as being helpful, not just doing word puzzles, but also having social interactions. And of course, social interactions do some of the things that you just described. That is to say, make you kind of come out of your chair and not only stand up and, meet somebody and so on and so forth.
Gesture and
you have to interact with them.
Gestures,
we know that
yes.
conversations, even conversations like this on a podcast, require a certain amount of attention that you don't necessarily.
And a kind of embodiment, the kind of, we're not just up here in a vat getting stuff put into it, we're actually interacting with the real world. And that's a mentally demanding thing that I love to tell people this. What's the first thing that happens, you think, when you go to push a button on an elevator? So you get on an elevator and you want to raise your arm and push the button.
Well, I have to find my powerful glasses usually.
Right.
Okay.
There you go.
There's that. But the other major thing that happens before you do this is that, let's say you're using your right hand, the calf muscle in your left leg tightens up. Why does it do that? Because your arm actually weighs about 12 pounds. And if you just stuck your arm out without doing that, you'd fall over. So we don't have any sense of the weight of our arm. But if you're, God forbid, have to take an anatomy class sometime and they pass a limb around, you'll be shocked to hold somebody's arm, just their arm, in your hand. And because it weighs a lot. If you stick it out to push a button, you'll fall over. So, but we don't know that's what's going on. We have no sense that that's what's going on. But your brain is doing these very difficult calculations, sophisticated calculations all the time. So yeah, just, standing around and talking is not a trivial thing. This embodiment, this actual living in the real world, I think is maybe one of the most important things for maintaining mental competence.
Well, aerobics comes up as one of the activities, of course, that Josh engages in, and some of that is wonderfully depicted by the mother, who is also acts as this wonderful aerobics instructor. But were you thinking about any of that in this, or?
I was. I mean, I don't know if I was thinking specifically about. I'm so fascinated by the The thing I'm thinking about right now is just how much I think this character's journey is towards understanding how little he knows or how little he's conscious of, even within his own body and even within his own brain, right? I think that's
exactly yeah. I mean, I think that's a great power of this piece is you do not come up with an answer at the end of it. This is not a play that has a prescription.
But I also think there's a lot of hope. You know, there's a lot of there's a lot of hope in that actually, and being like, I find that amazing that your like calf knows to do that. Like, how, you know, we don't have to look outside of our own bodies to be like sort of awed by how the mysteries of the world, right? You know, I just find that to be so fascinating, and I think for a character who thinks that self-knowledge will save him, you know, to ultimately, you know, there's this scene where, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, where he goes with his grandma to up into the mountains, and they're in a canyon, and it's sort of just about sort of feeling how small you are, right? And how little you are conscious of. And my experience, I think, of like getting sober was largely sort of the humility that comes with that. That sort of is like, I don't have an ability to control so many of these things, and ultimately, thank God I don't, right? Like, I don't want that. I actually like being like being in a brain that does things for me. I like being in a society, you know, well, maybe not this one right now, but I, you know, like the systems that hold us are actually kind of amazing. And I think to feel that sort of that they're, you know, it's healing for this character to make that realization over the course of the play. And I think, yes, specifically with exercise, he goes to, you know, aerobics at the JCC. He thinks a lot about what he's eating. He does all of those things and slams up against the limits of those things and sort of hoping that there'll be some sort of quick fix cure, but ultimately discovering that those things are also what give you meaning in your life, right? And the things, I think the good news, right? The bad news is that we have no idea sort of how to cure or treat either of these diseases. The good news is that the things that we do know that you can do are also the things that lead you towards a curious, happy, full, beautiful life. So that's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that physical activity is going to cure Alzheimer's or anything like that, just that we should be more balanced. It was typical to think that doing puzzles and reading and exercising your mind would somehow or another. Right. There's always this thing, you know, your brain is like a muscle, so your brain is not a muscle, it's an organ. There's a difference between organs and muscles. The brain is not a muscle. It doesn't react the same way as muscles do. So I only suggest all of this to mention that there's more than one way to think about it, and probably some ways we haven't thought of yet, as this character experiences.
Well,
in the
you know,
play,
we're still in a way inheritors of Descartes. You know, I think therefore I am. The brain is a mental organism primarily.
The most wonderful organ in your body.
Yes.
Well, there you are.
So it says, and it says it to me too. I'm thinking about that, but you know, the notion, of course, that either, you know, consciousness is only about thought, and of course at that point, you know, the self-recognition that goes into reporting about one's own thought. These are things, and these are conversations that are, of course, these days often in the context of asking whether machines have consciousness.
Yes.
And it's hard
and
to ask a machine.
And at what point humans no longer have consciousness? I mean, at what point do you say, well, I mean, this is the grandmother I love, the grandfather I love, but they're actually just not there anymore. This is just a ghost in the machine at the best, you know.
Well, I was
going to have to ask that question. You even have to ask it of yourself if you're an alcoholic and you get up and you can't remember the last 3 days. Well, was I conscious during those 3 days? Was there consciousness in my brain, or did it leave for 3 days?
Or what is the relationship between consciousness and memory?
Exactly.
Yes.
You know, can you have an identity that is associated with a particular consciousness without there being a trail of memory that constitutes, that populates that sense of self?
Yes. But of course, even memory is, you know, there's a famous case of HR or HM. Now we know his name, Henry Molaison. For years, he was only referred to as HM because he was still alive, who had undergone surgery that at the time was for epilepsy. It was a reasonable treatment for epilepsy, but left him without a hippocampus, a working hippocampus. So he couldn't form any short-term memories. So you could walk into the room and introduce yourself, even with some wacko name, do something crazy and all that, talk to them, then walk out, and 20 minutes later walk back in. He had no idea who you were. You go through the whole same thing again. But it turned out he could do this thing where you sit somebody down at a table and you give them a piece of paper with a star on it, and you ask them to trace the outline of the star, but they can only see it in a mirror. So that's actually very difficult to do because everything is backwards, right? So you have to learn how to do that. And he learned how to do that with practice. And at one point he actually said, you know, I'm surprised I'm so good at this, because he had no memory of practicing it, and yet he got better at it. So there's a whole other kind of muscle memory that goes on as well. Where's that? Where happens to that in Alzheimer's? I mean, I don't know that we test people on things like that with Alzheimer's, for example.
I mean,
whether they lose that as well.
My grandmother was a concert pianist, and till the very end, past the point where she was like unable to feed herself, unable to speak at all, you could put her hands on the piano, put a piece of music in front of her, and she'd play it, right?
And she could read the music. It wasn't just that she remembered it.
Right.
Or that she had not forgotten it. Or
right.
It was
No, she could read.
memory.
You could put any new. I remember putting Rhapsody in Blue in front of her. It was like, sort of like the test, just being like, how far can we take this? And she was like, she played mostly Baroque music, or or church music, a lot of church music too. And so it was sort of like she didn't have the jazz feel, but it was exact.
But
like
she had it right.
It's fascinating.
So again, I don't want to give away something that happens towards the end of the play, but it's such an interesting moment. So it's one of the two grandfathers. And Josh is helping him prepare for his second bar mitzvah, which he can do at the age of 83.
Yeah.
Of course, he's having trouble remembering the parts of the Torah that he has to recite. But there's a wonderful moment where he's searching for a memory that is clearly eluding him, when he gets up and he does a kind of almost Catskill comedy routine, which he does perfectly, and which it's not clear, from what goes on in the play, he's done before or whatever, but he clearly has timing, he has cadence, he has lines that, appear to come from an earlier part of his life. And then, of course, it is the earlier part of his life that he can recall that allows him to get through that scene. But I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that and how you put that together. I think it's a really brilliant moment in the play, but it also raises questions about long and short-term memory, and precisely about, who one is, what one's identity might be, what life and memory and how life and memory connect, but in ways that converge quite powerfully in that set of moments on the stage.
Well, I'd be very curious to hear Stuart talk about my experience with long and short-term memory is largely just from my actual experience, like in watching my grandparents, like being able to, pretty much all four of them, at least at one point, were able to speak about their childhood much more clearly than they were even able to speak about 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, right? That on some level that was deeper, more of a core memory for them. And I think for this character, the thing that I love about this character is in the play, another character with Alzheimer's, and this was true of my family members, it was fast and pretty much all of her function, my grandmother's function, was lost very quickly, as opposed to this grandfather who, it was gradual, very much so, right? And he knew what he didn't know for a long time, which I think is both a blessing and a curse, right? To sort of be like, what am I not holding on to? I know this. Why can't I figure this out? And I think the play really grapples with those questions, right? Like how much, something I thought about a lot with my grandmother, who was living for a long time past her body, was I just hope that she doesn't know, and I don't think she did. I really don't. And then, something I think about a lot is other family members who have died what I view as more tragic deaths, but deaths at an old age that were just super surprising, that were, because there wasn't that decline or because the slippage was slow, So I think it's sort of like, how are we thinking about, how much of the person is still there? I don't know. I sort of went off on a tangent there, but specifically with Shrimpy, yes, he's able to recall his first bar mitzvah more than his second bar mitzvah. And able to remember things that he doesn't even know that he remembers.
Doesn't know he remembers. That's right, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that is haunting and beautiful and true of most of us. The other thing about Shrimpy that I think is interesting is that he clearly has a shtick, right?
Yeah.
He's refined how to be himself, and it's something that I see even with folks that are not at the age where they would get Alzheimer's. My parents, please don't listen to this, but there's just more repetition. There just is. There's you I think decide on your things that you keep sort of telling people, and I've seen that sort of whittle and get smaller and smaller. Curious if there's any science there, but I think that's something I've thought about a lot.
Stuart?
Well, it's more psychology, I suppose, or social science than anything else. I don't have anything sciencey to say about that. I mean, certainly the issue of long and short-term memory, which itself is probably way too simplistic a way to think of it. I mean, memory is a very complicated thing. It happens in many places, and there doesn't seem to be any center of memory in the brain or anything like that. I mean, the hippocampus is important, but mostly in forming short-term memories that then get pushed into some other place that we don't really know, and don't seem to be as affected often by dementias and so forth. But it's a huge mystery. Can I just say for a moment, because I want to ask Jake a question. I mean, this is not particularly sciencey, but social. I want to ask him what effect the Sloan Foundation program has had on his number one desire to write this play and how it's worked out to produce it, because I think the work they're doing is extremely important, EST in particular and Sloan together. They've been at this for over 20 years and have continued to get playwrights some money at least and get them started and sort of push them into thinking about using science as a useful thematic pathway in writing. So,
I mean, like I said, this play opened every door for me, right? This was the play this was my first professional production, was this play last year in Denver. It's my New York debut. It was my first major commission. I hadn't been commissioned by another professional theater company before this play. It was the play I got into Julliard with. This play has opened up every door, and now it's being produced, with the Sloan Foundation as one of the co-producers. And I don't know the economics, but I don't think it would be happening otherwise. I think for me, I owe a lot to that program. And the other thing that I think is a little bit more esoteric is I think actually forcing myself to write a play that was specifically about science and use science in its engine allowed me to write a much more crisp and focused play than I had written up until that point. And having that assignment actually was hugely helpful artistically. And I think that is something that those structures and those assignments really open the door for actually, I think, more weird, wild, formative that are weird and wild things that are formative for my style. And I think this play is where I discovered this idea of the Greek chorus of grandparents was sort of born out of what do I want to say about the science, right? So
that's very gratifying to hear, because I think the program is not only valuable socially, that is bringing science into mainstream culture, but the idea of attracting artists to recognize that science could be a valuable theme, especially in the world we live in, which is, if not dominated by science, is certainly integral to it, science and technology. So why not begin to think of it as a useful theme, a starting place for artistic work as well? So that's very gratifying to hear that. Thank you, Jake.
And it's gratifying from the point of view of the New York Academy of Sciences as well. After all, the Academy started in the early 19th century, 1817, when the separations between the arts and sciences were not well established by any means. And I think one of the things that we're increasingly discovering here in the 21st century is that if you don't bring the arts and the sciences together, you're going to miss a great deal, but you're also going to simply not have the opportunity to show how our experience of the world is so critical to the kind of science we do as scientists, but also that the fundamental questions about life often are answered differently, but in ways that can help shed light on each other by the arts and the sciences.
Why not make the world a more interesting
So
place?
here at the Academy, we're thrilled by this, and we're thrilled on our episode of Shaping Science to have both of you with us. I feel like we could have gone on for much longer, but please go see the Reservoir and come back, Jake and Stuart, and talk to us again about the next play.
I have another Sloan commission. I have another Sloan commission specifically about anesthesia. So I'll be
that's
talking
really
about that.
interesting with anesthesia and consciousness.
I was thinking a lot. Yes, I was thinking a lot about what you were talking about, like in a blackout. Anyway, I know you were wrapping up, but you know, yet another subject in which we don't know much about sort of how it works, and it asks a lot more questions than it answers. And I'm excited to write that play.
Well, I'm excited to hear you're writing it, and so please come back when you have. Thank you so much.
Thank
it's
you for
great to
having
have
us.
you with us.
It's been a fabulous conversation. Thanks.
Thanks. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NYAS Sciences.